Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Fair Job podcast with myself, Richard Palmer.
And me, Steve Chilcott.
And it's a big welcome to Steve today. Steve has been very busy over the last couple of weeks because you may or may not know that Steve is a candidate in the general elections that we're having in the UK at the moment. So he's busy walking around the streets of London, shaking hands and kissing babies and all the other stuff that candidates do. And I'm very pleased to see that Steve hasn't yet been milkshaked. Have you, Steve?
No, not yet. I've escaped the McDonald's banana flavour so far.
Well, yeah, I mean, banana was particularly smelly. I would have thought that, surely the vanilla flavour is a bit more, sporting if you're going to milkshake anybody.
Well, maybe, but I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I would say banana is my favourite flavour of milkshake.
If you are in the Ealing part of London and you do fancy buying Steve a banana milkshake and giving it to him, I'm sure he'd be very grateful, but just don't hand it to him in the cup. Don't pour it over his head. So before we kick on today, please follow us on Spotify or YouTube. Please click like and subscribe if you can, if you like what we're talking about. And again, you'll find the various links in the chat below. Please consider following us on locals.com. And if you are running a business or you do employ people, please also consider joining the Fair Job Initiative, where we can help you create a great workplace and great work environment for you and your team and get everyone focused on work rather than worried about politics or what's going on the other side of the world or what pronouns to use with somebody, etc., etc., etc. So without further delay, as promised earlier today, we are going to be talking to Steve about the Labour Party's policies concerning work and the workplace and employment. And this, as Steve and I just been discussing this will be part of a couple of episodes we'll do where we'll look at all the parties' policies. Well, certainly the Tories, Lib Dems and Reform as well, policies on this. I think it's important to stress here that while Steve is a member and a candidate for the Reform Party, we are an apolitical company, and we'll be approaching this analysis from the viewpoint of an employer, won't we, Steve? We're looking for a neutral and objective analysis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and he's going to sort of run us through the headlines here. It's worthwhile pointing out, I think, that, as Steve's pointed out to me, that none of the parties have published their manifestos yet. So none of this is set in stone. So this might change between now and the election themselves.
Yes, that's correct. And, there is a lot of information on the Labour Party website that goes into a lot of detail, around employment and on other areas. But as you say, they've not confirmed their final manifesto. So theoretically, this could all change. I doubt whether it will all change. There could be some aspects of change, and certainly, I think Keir Starmer has already moved on quite a number of positions that have been sort of mentioned and discussed in the press. But as I say, there's a lot of information on their website, and clearly the whole world of employment, I think it's fair to say, is one area of key focus for the Labour Party. So going to sort of take us through the various points. And I think to show fairness, certainly in my personal view, there are some positive things in there. However, there are also things that I think are of somewhat potential concern to businesses and employers to a lesser or greater degree. So I guess sort of starting on some of the positives. So and actually, one of the first things they talk about in their information on their website is the subject of further education and lifelong learning. I think they, as I'm sure most parties, I would hope, do acknowledge that we do have some challenge around the whole area of lifelong training and development and skills areas for people. So they're actually talking about setting up what they're calling new technical excellence colleges in all areas around the country. And I think, these to really focus on vocational skills and skills requirements, and looking at a national plan for skills, and establishing an organisation called Skills England. Now, of course, yes, this could just be another bureaucratic quango, or it could be something that really, really adds value. And I think, the area of training and development for vocational skills is an area that, this country really needs some serious investment in. So on paper, that could be a very, very useful thing if done well and properly and without unnecessary bureaucracy. Um,
Yeah,
so,
that's a big if, isn't it?
well, it is indeed. And then one small aspect that they mention is about when it comes to the apprenticeship levy. So currently, employers, businesses can only spend their apprenticeship levy on specific apprenticeship schemes. So the Labour Party are actually proposing to widen that. So only 50% of an organisation's total levy would have to be spent on apprenticeship training, and the other 50% will be able to be on non-apprenticeship training.
I think that's really. I welcome that actually, because at the moment, from what I understand, there's vast amounts of unspent levy that's been
Yes.
collected because organisations either don't know how they can spend it or they haven't got the infrastructure to run apprenticeships. But there are still people who benefit from training.
Or just ignorant of it being there and using it. And I think people forget about it and forget that there's a pot of money that they can utilise there. So I think that's certainly a positive that they're broadening the what that can be used on. One other, what some people might think is a very small aspect, but I think it'd be important to some people, is the whole area around tips in hospitality. So they're actually going to make it statutory that tips in their entirety are shared directly with the relevant staff. And that if it isn't just shared directly one-on-one, then the staff have to be involved in deciding where that goes. That to me seems a wholly moral right and proper
Without a
thing to
doubt.
do.
I would welcome that entirely. I mean, I think that, you and I are old enough to remember a culture in Britain where there was no tipping. As we've become a more international outlook of a nation and our society's changed, tipping has become more part of British society. And we know some organisations add service charges, and then there's also tips on top of that. Now, as the father of a 17-year-old boy who has been working in a local restaurant on and off now, and I heard him being quite vocal about the distribution of tips and the owner of the restaurant, let's say not necessarily being as generous about the distribution of the tips as you might think he might be. It's pretty nefarious. I also know of many circumstances where service charge is used as a way of paying your staff rather than actually compensating them for the service they're giving. I think it's very welcome, and I think that we for many years the idea of service and hospitality in our society has not been treated as a career as it is in countries like Italy and Spain and France and also Germany. And this is something we need to change as a culture. It's seen as a sort of minimum wage job. It's seen as something that shouldn't be particularly well paid or well rewarded. And why an organisation wouldn't want to encourage their members of staff to be directly rewarded for customer service is just beyond me. I mean, I know there's a lot of pressure on hospitality, but it shouldn't be the staff that are having to carry the pain of that pressure.
Yeah.
That's not the route to go if you're a restaurateur or you're a bar owner. I think I welcome that. I'm completely in agreement with you on that one. I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. So sort of moving on. So, they also mention a few other things that sound in principle positive. So simplifying enforcement. So having a single enforcement body to cover all areas of workers' rights. That on paper sounds sensible to me. Further digitalising the employment tribunal service with the aim of making it quicker and more effective. I mean, we know that there are huge waiting lists and backlogs across the tribunal service at the moment. So, things like digitalising that, should be a help in part for that backlog. And then
I do have sorry to jump in again. I do have some slight concerns over that, based on what Tony Blair's government did to the court system back in the 90s. and this is around the commoditization of a justice process. So in theory, this is something that probably needs to happen because, as you say, we've got a backlog of 420,000 employment tribunal cases at the moment, and under the current capacity can only handle 80,000 a year. And this means a lot of people have been denied justice, and a lot of employers are also caught up with having to spend money and stress on things that drag on for years and years and years. I am slightly wary if the digitization suddenly turns the employment tribunal into the arbiters of workplace relations, because it suddenly becomes too easy to access. So there's, I think, there's a danger. And knowing the Labour Party, they've not always been brilliant at understanding that sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Well, yes, and I guess also, unintended consequences or ulterior motives of consequences.
I'm being generous.
And then also that they make reference to a review of health and safety legislation to make sure it's fit for purpose for the modern world. And I know when you do look at a lot of health and safety legislation, it does feel somewhat antiquated.
I couldn't agree more. My background until fairly recently was in manufacturing.
We have a visitor.
You've got a visitor. Never worked with children or animals.
No.
Having worked in manufacturing for many years, I'm very aware of and also in oil and gas. Health and safety is an issue, obviously, and the legislation around it has been getting, as you say, quite dated and quite complicated, particularly where we've had new legislation. Well, it's 13 years old now, like the corporate manslaughter laws, which really do put things front and center. The other thing I've noticed as well is I think there needs to be I'm hoping that if they do this, if they win and if they do this, then they are they look at the boundaries of concern of the health and safety executive. So, for example, one of the things the health and safety executive have recently added to their list of areas of responsibility is mental health. Now, in any health and safety scenario, there is a basis of behavior, of assumption of behavior, where you don't really need to spell everything out. So you don't spell out the fact that, you don't allow somebody who's got 10 pints of beer inside them to drive a forklift truck. Okay, that's not something you should have to spell out. You shouldn't play with matches. There are these sort of basic assumptions of what a reasonable person would think would be very foolish to permit, and you don't necessarily have to spell everything one of those things out. And I do think, as an HR person, I'm slightly concerned that for another department within an organization to be getting involved in the management of employees' mental health, when that department maybe isn't on top of the nuances around the law in terms of what's appropriate for an employer to do and not with their employees, is an area where I think needs some incision around who's responsible and what they're responsible for.
Yeah. So, moving on to some different areas, and there is a lot that they're suggesting currently of new things that they're going to be put into statute. Now, I think it can always be appropriate for a government to be strongly recommending and advising employers to do certain things and have codes of best practice, etc., etc. But of course, it just puts things into a very, very different scenario when they're proposing to make something statutory. So an example of the former, where they're recommending something, which again to me seems perfectly reasonable, is around terminal illness, where they're recommending employers to follow certain practices that are all, very admirable and empathetic towards staff around terminal illness of an employee, which, to me is fine, that, they're not making it statutory. However, there is a lot, as I say, that they are they are going to be putting into the law, and so some of the headlines that people may already be aware of that we can talk about a little bit more in detail are things like banning 0 hours contracts, changing the law about trade unions and about industrial action. I think, that, and of course the day one employment right entitlements moving from 2 years to day one. I think they're probably the three sort of largest, most significant headlines that we've heard about. So
there was a time, not so many years ago, when managing your business's HR was easy enough. Once a month, you'd pay your staff on time, you'd look after holidays, sick leave, pensions and other stuff. The only time the HR manuals were ever open was when you had to hire or fire someone. Life was straightforward and you could spend your time focusing on your business. But these days it seems like there's a never-ending cycle of HR crisis after HR crisis. From an increasing amount of red tape to demands you comply with the latest social justice movement to activist employees. How are you meant to manage all these competing demands that have nothing to do with a day job? It's hardly surprising that some days you might wonder why you got into business in the first place. There's an expectation that small businesses have the same legions of HR, lawyers and budgets for this sort of stuff that large employers have. There's also an expectation that you as a small business owner will understand the nuances and complexities of an increasingly complex employment law and Equality Act environment. This is incredibly unfair, time-consuming and costly. The problem is that if you get it wrong, and it's very easy to do this inadvertently, it might just end up costing you your entire business. That's why we set up Fair Job UK, the small business HR support service that allows you to get on with running your business. Join our increasing community of like-minded business owners and managers from all across the UK. It's considerably more affordable than you might think, and it may just be the best decision you made this year. Visit us at fairjob.co.uk or email contact@fairjob.co.uk.
I guess if we start on the 0 hours contracts now, again, they have been giving different messaging on this. At one point the messaging from the Labour Party is that they're banning it outright, at the next point that they're not, that they're contemplating that. Certainly currently on their website all they talk about is completely banning 0 hours contracts and implementing anti-avoidance measures as well as banning them. Now we wait to see whether they actually proceed with that absolute banning of 0 hours contracts. And my view on 0 hours contracts is, firstly, some people like them and want them. That there are many people in our society who absolutely want that. They don't want the strict requirement that they have to go in and work set shifts every week, every month. They want the absolute flexibility to not work at all for a month and then to work lots the next month. I've personally done that. I personally have implemented 0 hours contracts employers over 15 years ago, and it was very useful. I think we're probably aware that there have been some organisations that maybe almost their entire business model has been based on resourcing their services on 0 hours contracts. I personally don't think that's a good business model to operate or necessarily fair to people.
I think it's also a dated one as well. Whilst these organisations did exist, they have been. The market has changed.
So we wait to see which way they bend, but certainly currently they seem to be bending to banning them. And when we come on to the trade union thing, I do get the impression that some of the early noises that the Labour Party was giving, the trade union movement reacted very negatively towards. And I think 2 weeks ago there was a meeting of all the general secretaries and the heads of the main trade unions with the Labour Party, and I think the Labour Party got a bit of a stern talking to, because certainly the messaging that seems to have come out since that meeting seems to be much more placatory towards the trade union perspective. The subject of 0 hours contracts, I think, is a subject that the trade union movement does pay a lot of attention to.
Well, I noticed this actually. I think in the paper yesterday, Unite are not endorsing Labour. They've come out formally
Yes.
and said they're not going to back Labour. So I think this is a very interesting point about 0 hours contracts. I do want to cover it in a little bit more detail because a lot of the smaller businesses that we work with, particularly in industries like hospitality, they rely on 0 hours contracts as a way of, for instance, employing students or employing people like my son, for instance.
Mm.
You know, and there is I think that there's a big point about 0 hours contracts that's been missed here, and but by the parties, and that is if you are in a market where there is full employment, which we actually have here, we have enough jobs for everybody in this country.
Mm.
Whether or not people want to work those jobs is a different kettle of fish. But at the moment, you're seeing an employment market where if employees want to work, then they're not being forced to work 0 hours contracts. There are jobs out there they can do which aren't 0 hours contracts.
Quite.
So the market tends to police these things, and of course, this is the antithesis of Labour as a philosophy, which is to control rather than to allow the market to control demand. There are some other major headaches around this because I think what we're seeing coming out of California, where there's been some very aggressive workplace, quite hard left workplace politics going in, including a huge hike in the minimum wage, is we're seeing this predictably result in fewer opportunities and a drop in jobs, redundancies, and also employers being very reluctant to hire staff. And I'm concerned that this will actually stop people like students from picking up casual work. It'll create unnecessary and expensive paperwork around the engagement of people for casual work, and I can understand why the trade unions don't like it because they don't like the whole idea of casual work. They don't believe it should exist. But frankly, it's a very important part of our economy, and if you make it difficult, then all you're going to do is drive that sort of work underground. People will end up paying people cash in the hand, and those people won't be captured by the revenue service. They won't be captured by, captured by contracts of employment, and it'll actually make the thing much worse. There's one other point I'd like to make about 0 hours contracts, and I've just before we set up FairJob, my area of expertise was in running temporary resourcing at healthcare organizations. And NHS trusts staff their shifts 4 ways actually. They use permanent staff, they use overtime of permanent staff, they use agency staff, but they also use something called a staff bank. So the staff bank is a way where their employees can earn extra money by picking up additional shifts that are paid on a 0 hours contract. So they'll hold 2 contracts of employment with their employer. They'll hold a permanent employment of contract, and they'll hold a 0 hours contract for the staff bank work they do. And the reason why they have 2 contracts is because that second contract is paid at a much higher rate than the hourly rate they get paid for their permanent job. So if you're an A&E doctor, for instance, middle-ranking A&E doctor, you'll do your 40 hours a week at the sort of 80 grand a year or whatever you get paid for it, and then that last shift that you do, that bank shift that you can pick up once per week without hitting your working time issues, you can pick that up at 100, 120, 130 pound an hour, and that'll be paid for through a 0 hours contract. So I would be very interested in understanding what exactly the Labour Party are going to do to address the staffing of NHS bank shifts, which constitutes somewhere between 10 and 18% of all shifts worked in the NHS. Because if they don't get this right, they could seriously jeopardise healthcare provision in the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also end up costing the NHS a fortune and trying to have to rewrite or find a contractual scenario.
Well, wholly, absolutely, because again, the places where I introduced 0 hours contracts for 10, 15 plus years ago, and actually one of those was in the care sector. So again, it was care staff, and another one was in customer service. And actually the main driver for doing that in both scenarios was previously both businesses relied on agency staff.
Yeah.
and of which you're obviously paying, particularly with agency worker regulations now, you're paying commission, you're paying a margin to the agency on top of by a business directly employing its own bank 0 hours staff. You are avoiding paying that margin, that commission to an
Exactly.
agency who's streaming off a profit.
Exactly. And that saves money for the customer, it saves money, and in the public sector, it saves money for the taxpayer.
Yeah, so again, it's a potential, another example of an unintended consequence, banning 0 hours contracts. So therefore businesses are having to rely on recruitment agencies more, temp staff agencies more, which is only going to push the price up. And, within the Labour Party, what they're saying, as well as banning these, they're talking about making a statutory requirement to pay staff compensation where a shift is cancelled.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Frequently you're using a 0 hours contract because it's an unpredictable resource requirement. If you're running a visitor attraction and it's pouring down with rain, then you're going to need less staff. And you obviously can't predict that before. So
I do find this is where it's so frustrating. As you and I are experts in the deployment of staff. We understand the nuances of things like 0 hours contracts, permanent contracts, agency use inside out. Yeah. And what's so infuriating about this is a point at which the parties who are opposing Labour could actually go after them on.
Absolutely.
This could have enormous implications for the NHS. Yeah. Which absolutely relies on the ability to book flexible resource. In fact, any working environment where you are dealing with shift-based staff, you have to have some sort of bank system, or you're going to end up, and if you're going to penalize them for having to cancel flexible shifts, it shows a lack of comprehension of the realities of how modern workplaces function by a political class who I just think haven't got a bloody clue, frankly. This is extremely frustrating.
No,
it's extremely frustrating.
This will have particularly huge impacts on healthcare and in social care, but also, as you say, hospitality, retail, warehouses, all sorts of where the requirements for staff is always variable and changeable. So, should we move on?
Well, that's a bit depressing. Okay.
I'm afraid the rest of this is going to be fairly depressing. This big one is the basic day one right. So just to clarify for people, currently individual cannot claim for unfair dismissal until they have acquired 2 years continuous service with one employer. And Labour Party are proposing to change that 2-year requirement down to an entitlement from the first day of anyone's employment. So this would be a very big change. Now, they do mention that, employers can still follow probation policies and probation procedures. But despite that, this is going to cause greater risk and greater costs to employers, and it's very strange how the way that they introduce this on their website, implying that I'll just read some of it out. The rate at which people move jobs has been declining, posing risks to productivity, because the lengthy wait for basic rights means the risk of moving jobs falls heavily on the individual. But I don't see how that's going to encourage them to move. Because firsthand they're saying people are moving less. Yeah. However, their movement is discouraged by the 2-year wait.
I can understand where this is coming from. I think this has been very badly worded. I mean, one thing I do agree. I do think that the 2-year wait is too long in the current work environment. Where the average length of time most people spend in a job, I think, is something like 2.5 years or something. Yeah. So to have a situation where people are not able to access workplace protections around things like constructive dismissal for 2 years is frankly a bit absurd in the modern age. However, day one is just crazy. I mean, we have probation in organizations for very, very good reasons. And surely, the minimum on this, I would say, should be 6 or 9 months at the very, very minimum. And I would probably settle for a year, actually, as being a sensible point. But from day one, this is just going to end up in, never mind 420,000, employment tribunal backlog. This is going to go nuclear. How on earth would a new employee coming in on day one suddenly gets into a situation where they perceive that they have been in some way unfairly treated, let's say misgendered or something, and then the storm off out of the company, and then turn around and sue through an employment tribunal the employer. So there's that perspective, and this this is just going to weaponize the Equality Act to attack employers, especially small businesses who aren't as on top of this sort of thing as most organizations might be.
Yeah, and as you and I know, Richard, that there is always a scenario where, for whatever reason, a new person starting a new job, it doesn't work out. It's you say it's a failed recruitment process, or either party, either the individual or the employer, just concludes actually this isn't a great fit. It's not working out. But you and I also know that sometimes when an employer is making that decision to say goodbye to a new employee during or at the end of their probationary period, the individual doesn't take it very well. And you can get complaint and what have you. And as you say, yes, this will they'll just
absolutely.
be filing into the tribunal.
I would say probably in about 60% of the situations that I've been involved in with clients over the last few years, when you fire somebody, or you part ways after probation, you invariably get, I would say in the majority of cases, probably about 60% of cases, you invariably get one of them trying it on around a discrimination claim of some sort. Because of the prevalence of no-win, no-claim solicitors out there touting for business, and I mean, I even had a pro forma letter that I used to give my clients to send to the lawyers, telling them to sue or be damned. This is a big problem. The other question I've got on this one, Steve, is principle of English common law is the principle of tort, which means that there has to be a loss in order to get compensation from such a situation. So how on earth would you, let's say on day one of a job, how would you be proving that? How would you be proving that tort? You could say, well, I left another job to join this company and on day one it went horribly wrong and I had to leave. Well, okay, but there's personal responsibility involved here. You chose to leave that previous job, okay? So your next employer is that next employer really responsible for making an error in recruiting you, or for putting you in a situation like this? I mean, I can understand there will be scenarios where it can give people some protection. For instance, someone has to relocate, and we do see this when people are relocating across the country, and they're 6 months into the job, it's not working out, and yet they've pulled their kids out of school, they've had to check halfway across the country, and suddenly they've had a change of boss or whatever. Particularly in a smaller company, can handle it very badly. Then I can see this as actually being, giving him a benefit. But there has to be some loss. So if you're on your first day at McDonald's or something, and, you don't like it and you decide to leave, and then you decide to take the McDonald's to an employment tribunal for something, where's the loss? Where's the loss?
This change is going to understandably make employers more apprehensive during the recruitment process. And I guess makes the recruitment process even that more important to get it right, that you are making the right selection decision. when you're bringing in people in, because it could be more costly if you don't make the right decision.
I'd be very, very interested to get the perspective of Tanya de Grunwald on this, who and also of those a couple of other people we know who are involved in the hiring and promoting the hiring of young people.
Well, yes, because recruiters are going to be more risk averse, aren't they? Because of this,
absolutely.
and therefore it might be of detriment to certain types of people,
and not just employers, but recruitment agencies will be more careful, because if you are a recruitment agent and you place somebody in a company and that person ends up leaving the company within a period of time, usually it's 6 months, then you've got to give either all or a chunk of your feedback, depending on your terms of business with your clients. So the last thing you want to be doing is placing somebody into a business or an organization where they're going to leave in this first year. It's damaging for your business. It's damaging. You'll have already drunk the commission. By the time if that person ends up leaving, and then you're in a bit of trouble. So I do think that there are some serious issues here, Steve, and as you say, this is another great example of unintended consequences, and the unintended consequence here is going to be a increase in risk aversion around recruitment, especially with younger people.
Because all of us that have been involved in recruitment, sometimes when you're shortlisting applications, for example, you include a wild card, and sometimes you appoint a wild card, because the risks might be high, but the rewards can be huge. Just by recruiting someone who's really got quite a different set of skills or experience, but you think, actually, I want to take that risk and try them out. As we say, people are just going to be generally more risk averse because of this.
And I actually think that this we talk a lot about EDI and the impact of EDI, and we talk about inclusion at work, and I actually think this is the type of policy that will cause problems for inclusion at work, because if you're an employer, particularly small employer, and you are at risk of a situation where you end up in conflict with your staff, would you be so keen to take on a member of staff who has disability challenges, or who has maybe ADHD issues or something like that, when on one hand you've been encouraged to take people like this on the other hand, if there's a risk, then let's face it, you're gonna be thinking, well, do I really want to go down this route? And you could turn around. I know what the response will be. It'll be, oh, shut up, Palmer, what do you know you're talking about? It's against the law to discriminate against that. Well, you know what, guys, in the real world where Steve and I live, employers will decide to recruit somebody or not based on their opinion of the risk of that person or the benefit of that person coming on board. And they won't turn around and say, I don't want to recruit that guy because I think he's high risk because he's got ADHD. They'll reject him for some other reason. Okay? And that's the reality. And the reality is, if you want to encourage employers to take on people who have got challenges in their lives and who could actually, as you say, Steve, could be a really good benefit to that business, could be a real wild card, could be a creative thinker, somebody who's passionate or whatever, who's maybe not particularly polished, then this is going to have precisely the opposite effect as that was intended.
Okay, so moving on, and the next one that I'll just cover briefly, it's quite a significant change, but to be honest, it's not a that commonly used thing anyway, and it's the fire and rehire scenario. So they are going to outlaw the ability of an employer to fire and then rehire. So just to explain, this is typically done when an employer wants to alter some significant terms conditions of employment, and there has to date being the ability for them just to dismiss, end the employment, and then immediately rehire on the altered terms conditions. So I say it's rarely used. I've never personally used it or worked in an organisation that uses it. I actually feel slightly uncomfortable with the concept, so I don't necessarily have
Yeah.
a huge problem with it going. But when it comes down to the basic statement of when the economy is in this position, is this the right sort of moment to be introducing
Well,
potential extra burden to employers?
I couldn't agree more. And the other thing is that, I would actually call this out as being a bit of a straw man law. It's one of those things a bit like conversion therapy, isn't it? We do not have hordes of fundamentalist Christians patrolling the back streets of the United Kingdom, forcing gay people into conversion therapy. Okay, that just doesn't happen in the United Kingdom. And I think that this is another one of these cases where you've got something that you find in other jurisdictions that may have been a problem in the past. And I think certainly if you go back to certainly before, post World War II, you had problems with this sort of thing. But it hasn't been an issue in the United Kingdom for a very, very long time because the market dictates it's not an issue. The market dictates it. And also is this other thing, is this idea that employers are all some sort of, cynical Victorian mill owners who are busy there in their top hats and their monocles exploiting their workers. Now this is just simply not the case.
But of course, we did have the P&O example, which
there is that, yeah.
I suspect is probably what might be behind this, because that was quite widely thought of as quite a bad move by P&O, and they came into a lot of criticism.
P&O used the very specific point of being able to hire cheaper overseas labor to get from that one, and that's something that could be addressed through immigration law as opposed to through through a sort of one-stop shop. I personally don't think this is a problem in our industry, in our sector. I've not seen it. I've been in the racket for 30 years. I've never done this, and certainly any organization who's suggested it, I think there may have been at one point a conversation I had maybe 20 years ago where we thought about might be an idea. We decided not to do it because it was just immediately dismissed in the meeting. It's like, oh, you don't do that. You're not going to do that. It would look really bad in the press, and of course it does look bad in the press. So employers don't do it. It seems to be straw manning, I think, and
So I'm just going to rifle through a few other points that we probably don't need to discuss, but just to mention them, around redundancy rights and TUPE. So one point of clarity, where you have periods of consultation based on the number of people that you're making redundant, for example, there's always been a little bit of confusion around, do those people have to be employed in one site? And that was the reality of the law. That if you were making, for example, 20 or more people redundant on one site, sometimes obviously that was slightly confusing with multi-site organisations. Was it one site or not? They're now simplifying that in a way that's not beneficial to the employer. So it's the actual employer. So how many people the employer is making redundant, irrespective of locations. So obviously that could raise the bar of where on consultation periods. Whistleblowing strengthened to cover people. Well, it says women who report sexual harassment at work. Now, I can't believe that would only be unidirectional, and that wouldn't also apply to men claiming sexual harassment at work. It's interesting that their website only refers to women being sexually harassed.
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that immediately gets you in trouble with the Equality Act, because you can't discriminate based on sex. So
right, I suspect that's just the word that the ill-advised wording of their website.
Yeah, I think on the consultation piece, I can see that as actually being something that don't have too much of a contention with. I think in the modern day and age, particularly with the fact that so much of work has moved from the office to the home or to elsewhere. Workers are multi-site. We're not all going down mill, or down pit these days. So
They also talk about strengthening rights and protections of those of self-employed workers, including giving the self-employed a legal right to a written contract. Now, Richard and I were only talking earlier that actually the reality for some very small businesses is that staff aren't even getting their written contracts where legally they are already required to. So again, this will be an additional burden to particularly very small
Yeah,
businesses.
I'm, having someone who's sort of, had to run the engagement of temporary staff, be they agency temps, 0 hours contract people, self-employed individuals, limited companies, sole traders. I'm struggling to understand this and how this fits around IR35, and at a time when most organizations these days will engage self-employed individuals directly,
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to outside IR35. I can actually see the benefit here because I think that one of the things I've noticed is, particularly in the public sector, who should know a lot better, is quite cynical use of direct engagement without any particular, without really respecting some of the aspects of employee rights. And some of the stuff I've seen has been very, very close to the border. And actually, if you're honest, if that's where your exploitation is these days, it's not in temporary. It's not in temporary staff. It's not in 0 hours contract. It's in this type of temporary member of staff. Where they don't want to make the commitment for headcount, and yet they don't want to. There's an issue around tax, so they can't take on someone as a limited company. And as you said earlier, this is just going to drive employers to engage agency workers, which is going to put the costs up. And it's also going to increase the number of temps and decrease the number of permanent employees, because if you make permanent employment too painful for an employer to implement, which it pretty much is getting very close to that point, and you make it too risky for them to do, then they're just going to simply staff their business with temps.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
And if you're then protecting the temps this way, then you're actually just making it more of a reason for the employer, not to offer someone a permanent contract.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another self-defeating policy.
So going to counter on. So parental leave is now going to become a day one right. In terms of a woman who's pregnant, the current situation where it's unlawful to dismiss a woman while on maternity leave or whilst pregnant is now going to be extended for 6 months after her return to work. Bereavement leave is going to be introduced as a right for all workers. Sick pay, so statutory sick pay, they're going to remove the lower earnings limit to make available to all workers, but also, I think probably even more significant, remove the waiting period. So currently, where someone doesn't have contractual sick pay, so they're only entitled to statutory sick pay, you only get statutory sick pay from, is it day 4 or day 5?
Day 5, it's day 5, isn't it?
Day 5, so now that will be from day 1, so again, that will be extra cost and burden.
And I can see that also, causing problems because, what's to stop an employer then going, well, actually, we're going to take away our sick pay and we're just going to have statutory sick pay from day 1. So, is that going to backfire on them?
So the next point, our friend Tanya is certainly going to like. So in terms of unpaid internships, they are going to ban unpaid internships, except where they're a part of an educational training course. And I've often wondered how will they distinguish within the law the difference between an unpaid internship and any other voluntary arrangement? Particularly in the charity sector, charities rely very heavily on volunteer workers. They cannot jeopardize that. And I just wondered precisely what the detail would be between an internship and another voluntary working arrangement.
later this summer, my son's school, after the exams, they put them out to work experience.
Yeah.
And he's doing some experience up at Vindolanda Roman Fort. And he's got a 2 weeks worth of work experience up there.
Yeah.
So now that's, as I understand it, is not paid. So how would that?
Well, whether that would be because they do mention the exclusion of, unless it's connected to what did I say? There was something about unless it's connected to training.
Okay, yeah.
Part of an educational training course, I guess that.
Right.
I can't imagine school, college work experiences will be covered. Right, so probably the last area, and this is quite a major area, is the whole thing around trade unions. And, they make very bold statements that, they're committed to strengthening the rights of working people by empowering workers to organise collectively through trade unions. To be more specific, they are going to simplify the process for trade union recognition. So where an employer doesn't have an existing collective agreement with a trade union, they're going to simplify the process for the staff to gain a collective agreement. They're also saying that they're going to implement some statutory aspects. So basically giving trade union representatives legal entitlement to have access to the workplace, even where there is no collective agreement or where there is no trade union. So if you're running a business and one of your staff joins a trade union or knows a trade union member, that trade union member will have legal entitlement to access your workplace and speak to your staff. That, to me, is quite shocking. Obviously, depending on the detail.
Yeah.
And all employers will have, again, irrespective of whether they have trade union agreements or not, will have a legal duty to inform their new staff of their right to join a trade union. So basically, every employer will become a recruitment tool for trade unions. So, if you're now, it doesn't mention any threshold of business size. So it's basically saying, you've got a new member of your team starting on Monday. You have to point out to them that they can join a trade union. And then finally, but not least, that they're going to introduce statutory rights for trade union equality reps. So specific trade union reps around EDI will acquire statutory rights. That is indeed a head-in-hand moment, isn't it?
So head in the hand here because, those of you who are regular viewers will know that we have some issues with equality, diversity, and inclusion, or DEI training as it is. You'll also know that we have had some, the worms beginning to turn on EDI and how it's been implemented. We've had some very distressing evidence coming out of a number of quite robust surveys that have been run this year that suggest that EDI, as it's been implemented, is backfiring horrifically. This is now crossing the radar of HR directors and boards of directors in the corporate world. And we're beginning to look at and question how this is done, because it's obvious that there's been an awful lot of very cheap EDI that's been implemented that has been very harmful to people in the workplace. Now, I'm not going to go into that here. We've got lots of information on this. If you want to have a look at our podcasts and our blog, etc., you'll find it all there and on our locals as well. One thing I will say is that whilst the conversation is beginning to move on this, the conversation that's coming out of the Labour Party seems to be pretty out of date on this. And we saw there was an interview last month with Analysed in the Telegraph, where she was asked about EDI, given that Kemi Badenoch had been highlighting the evidence from the report that the government had done into this, and it was a neutral report done by experts. They weren't the Conservative Party activists who did this report. They were a good balance of professionals working in HR and in the sector and in EDI. And the response from Annalise Dodds was very much along the lines of, this is the Tory party playing culture war again, and that McKinsey had issued a report saying how wonderful DEI was and EDI was, and how every organisation should do it as it adds wealth to the organisation. Now, that report last year was essentially debunked because the evidence that had been used to form the report was shown to be a complete hokum. And if I remember rightly, McKinsey had to climb down and say, actually, maybe we could have been more robust with our evidence. As a result, those of us in the know in the EDI sector and in HR haven't been using this report as justification. Quite the opposite, where people have been using this report as justification. Then they are being, advised not to. They've been advised to revisit this and have another look at their policies. Now, when Annalise Dodds gave this interview, several quite high-hitting HR thought leaders on LinkedIn actually weighed into the conversation and said, what are you doing? I think you need to update your thinking here. And this is either an indication of a politician being badly briefed by her team, or have a completely different agenda and is actually wanting to peddle the agenda that's very specifically spelt out in that McKinsey report, which has been proven to have been purely an ideological work of fiction.
And then I'm going to add one more subject, which I know Richard will also be very animated about, and this is around procurement. And, well, so firstly, to quote them, they say they are going to bring about the biggest wave of insourcing of public services. So clearly they have an intention, I'm sure this was being led by the trade union pressure on them, of bringing services back into the public sector that have previously or are currently outsourced to the private sector. Private organisations providing any aspects of public services will be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And this is the icing on the cake. Through our national procurement plan, Labour will ensure social value is mandatory in contract design.
That's a big problem. So, but this bit around mandated EDI in procurement is extremely toxic, because this is exactly what is causing the headache that you'll hear me banging on about, and Steve, you're trying to calm me down about the impact that ESG and EDI is having on small businesses around the country. And it's been catastrophic because it's been done very badly, and it's creating more problems than it's solving. So I think that such a policy would be some time away. I think if they won power, that would take them a while to bring that in. And I think between now and then, there'll be enough evidence to show why this has been a very bad idea.
Apparently they're basing it on a model that has been used in Wales by the Labour Party
Wales,
in Wales.
That beacon of public governance.
So they're planning a procurement bill, and that will be, mandating requirements that will include businesses to have effective equality policies and adherence to high environmental standards. So we can only just imagine what that will cover.
This is basically peddling the WEF mandate. The World Economic Forum have been trying to force governments into introducing this. It's been brought in other European countries and in other parts of the world. And it's one of the reasons why in Holland and in Germany, the farmers have kicked off so much. I think also if you look at the Welsh government, I'd be very interested to see what the actual real world delivery is on this. because we know that Wales has got some major problems in terms of its economy. If I was the Labour Party, I'm not sure I'd be using them as an example for anything at the moment. If Wales is a blueprint of what a Labour government would look like for employers in the UK, across the UK, then God help us if they win the election, quite frankly. So thanks for going through that, Steve. It's that's pretty deep dive, and there's a lot of food for thought there. And I think I don't know what you think, but I think what we should probably do is depending on who wins this election, or when they publish their manifesto, we should maybe have another deep dive and look at some of these particular issues, like zero-hours contracts, for instance, in some greater detail, particularly as to how it would impact our clients. And then I think if Labour do win the election, then we need to probably institute a sort of emergency analysis of what's likely to happen and what we would recommend our clients do to help manage what's going to be not inconsiderable fallout. This is all quite depressing from my perspective, I think, because those of us who are old enough to remember the world before Tony Blair remember a world where there wasn't a huge amount of red tape. Running a business was quite straightforward, particularly around employing people and engaging people. And, the Blair government came in and carried out some major constitutional and social change in the UK. And some of that has had some pretty bad unintended consequences. And this dabbling again with these points of law without really having evidence that they have fought them through properly. I suppose the one area that we do have that may help here is the consultation period of any bill that's been proposed. Labour will have to listen to employers as well as listen to the trade unions and their own activists. And of course, the problem with policies that are written in back offices in London Bank or whatever is their bankmen. They're being scribbled down by activists who aren't actually.
In the open text, they're very mindful of saying, we're very supportive and want to work with both businesses and trade unions, but then go on and list a plethora of policy positions that I think a lot of them would be challenging to say they're in any way employer business helpful.
I mean, I would also, if I was a trade union, I'd be asking myself some questions as well, which is one of the questions I'd ask myself as a trade union is why are so many, small business workers can join trade unions if they want to. So why are so many, why do they fail to make any traction with small business workers? And of course, it's because they do nothing to, they don't add any value to that worker.
Well, quite, which is also why they're desperate, with that the statutory entitlement for union representatives to enter any workplace, for the statutory requirement for every employer to be pointing their new staff in the direction of the trade union. That's why those things are in there, because they're very.
I hope to hell that they put a minimum size of business on this law if they do bring it in, because if they are seriously wanting to apply this to every employer, right down to the very smallest, it's gonna. You're gonna have a situation where, somebody's, where pubs and hairdressers are suddenly in a situation where they've got to engage with union shop stewards.
Mm-hmm.
And what experience have those union shop stewards got of knowing what the pressure of a small business like that's under? They'll come in with their big employer attitudes, and they'll be busy demanding pay rises that the business just can't possibly meet, with threats of industrial action.
Yeah. So on that positive point.
Anyway, guys, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. So we've been on the talk about an hour. If you've got anything you'd like to add, then please do so below. Like I say, we're going to be doing more work on this and churning out a lot more content around, well, what could this mean actually? Because this is going to be a big area of headache for our clients. Yeah, chin up.
Until next time.
Until next time, if you like what you see, give us a like down below. Follow us on YouTube and on Spotify and on the Twitter, where we are Fair Job UK. And also, you can find us at www.fairjob.co.uk. If you are an employer and you are concerned about what might happen here and you want some objective advice, then by all means please join our initiative, the Fair Job Initiative. It's very reasonable. And Steve and I will keep you on the straight and narrow. And if we can't give you that, then we'll give you a shoulder to cry on. In the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Cheers. All the best.